Okay, so hi Rob, thank you for your time. And what is the concept behind Transition Town?
Behind Transition Town is that we need to is that we live in times of great uncertainty, and we live in times where is the people talking in the background a problem? Do I need to move somewhere quieter? Is it okay? It's okay. All right. Okay. So the idea of transition is that we live in very uncertain times, whether it's through climate change or through the volatility of energy prices and problems with supply, and also with the huge debt crisis, which has only really just started, I think. And when you put those things together, then one of the challenges is really the fact that we are um, very, very vulnerable in our local economies, that we have very little resilience left in our local economies, and that rather than how resilience is normally understood, which is the ability to meet a shock from outside and not just fall to pieces, in transition we say, well, actually putting that resilience back could be an enormous opportunity for the economies of the place that we live. And in fact, as we move forward, I think it's going to be probably the only place where economic activity is going to come from in the future. So making our food systems more resilient, our energy systems more resilient, how we get around the place more resilient, how we build our houses becoming more resilient. All of those things, they make us less vulnerable to shock, but at the same time, they are also an enormous opportunity for reskilling, retraining, entrepreneurship, creativity, building community. So the end of the age of cheap energy, the end of the age of economic growth, is the end of something, but it's also the beginning of something else. And so transition is really about embracing that and the possibilities that it presents with creativity and imagination. It's a bottom-up grassroots movement. It has its feet rooted in permaculture principles. That was where it originally came from. But I think what it tries to do is to take permaculture and to try and put it in a wrapping which makes it much more accessible to the mainstream somehow, and to business and that kind of thing.
Okay, so how you came up with the idea of Transition Town, which was the spark?
The spark was, I mean, I taught permaculture for about 10 years. So when I found out, so for me, it was finding out about peak oil and working as a permaculture teacher and trying to think how permaculture principles could be applied to this challenge in a shorter period of time. And I was teaching at a college in Ireland where we'd set up the first 2-year full-time permaculture course, and I set my students a project to try and work out how you could apply permaculture principles to the town where we were, breaking its oil dependency over a 20-year period. And it's kind of evolved from then really into, with lots of other inputs and ideas and inspirations, to the place where there are now thousands of transition projects around the world.
What role play resilience in the transition concept?
It's one of the very, very central concepts, and I think it's one of the really big ideas of our time. And I think it's very interesting since we started doing transition, how the idea of resilience has gone, how you hear it being used much, much more often in kind of mainstream contexts, and how people who work in the government and talk about resilience, where they mean emergency preparedness, for big shocks, are now starting to talk about transition. So resilience is a really central idea, I think, because sustainability tends to assume that this is a gradual, steady process. In even the word permaculture, implies a permanent culture, something which reaches a point at which it can be steady. Whereas, of course, that when you add in resilience thinking, you also need to have in that the ability to withstand shocks. When you get those shocks, which are increasingly likely now through peak oil, through climate change, through what's happening with economics, the need to have that flex built in is really, really important. And I think it's an idea that's very much within permaculture. Looking at how natural systems work and how they have that ability to flex. And I suppose one of the key ways that we look at how you create resilience is through that idea of localization and the idea of making economies more not independent from each other, but more not self-sufficient, but more self-reliant. It's like in an oil tanker, that when they go on long journeys full of oil, if they didn't have any bulkheads, any things that divide up the oil into different bits, every time you'd hit a wave, the oil would slosh from one side to the other, and the ship would turn over very quickly. So you build in these bulkheads, which mean that it can have the shock, but it can remain stable. Economically, we've removed a lot of those bulkheads, with the deregulation of the banks and so on, and with economic globalization. And so transition is about putting those back in again in such a way that that is actually seen as the opportunity and a step forward economically now.
Can you give me some practical example of local solutions for a low energy future?
Yeah, well, we've just published a book called The Transition Companion, which is a sort of an update of what transition is and what people are doing. And there's lots of stories in there. And I suppose some of them would be, so for example, you've got quite a few places setting up their own community energy companies. So the city of Bath just raised £732,000 in a community share option. They want to put £11 million worth of renewables in place within the next few years, which will generate £300,000 a year for transition in the city. You've got a place called Lewis, where they had a community share option and they raised money to set up the UK's first community solar power station. Currency that you'll be able to pay your taxes in, which will be printed notes and a phone-based currency too. There's lots.
What is it, a transition initiative?
A transition initiative is a group of people who come together in a place, and they may already know each other, or they may come together because one of them organizes an event, or they may be an existing group that decides it wants to shift its focus a little bit to becoming a transition project. And they would start to meet, and they would start the process really. And the way that we set it out in the new book, in the Transition Companion, is that it's like that they would design a process that is appropriate to the place where they live, and it would be it would by assembling a number of ingredients. So there's different ingredients that we've created in the book, which are things that we see happening out there in transition projects. So, but the first one that's really important is that when they come together as a transition initiative, they give some time and focus to how they're going to work as a group. How are they going to make sure that they don't all fall out and within 6 months be taking each other to court? How can we ensure that actually it's something which will work? Kind of the people care side of things, that's given, because sometimes the drive to we must do stuff, we must get on and do stuff, actually if the time isn't given to getting the group right at the beginning, it's not going to be it's going to struggle a lot more. So the transition initiative is that group of people that come together. Initially they may not call it transition, they may just be a group of people meeting, but at some point then they become transition wherever, and then they kind of start working in that kind of a context. I think the thing with being a transition initiative is always being open to working with as many different people as possible. So we really encourage transition groups to work with the local council if they can, with other community groups, um, and there's some really exciting examples I think of that around the country, around the world.
Now we are all living in a transition basically toward a new society and economy apparently. Which role the transition movement can play in this current economic crisis?
A really, really important role, I think, and it's the role firstly, it's the role of asking the questions which still national and local government feel unable to ask, in terms of questioning the concept of economic growth, of pointing out that you can't do economic activity, you can't do economic growth until you can break that oil dependency. I think transition groups have a really important role in terms of modeling the next economy, because while our governments are still fixated on economic growth, and the need to do whatever it takes in order to make economic growth happen again, then what they aren't doing is the very thing that actually is what needs to be done, which is strengthening local economies, boosting entrepreneurship at the local level, applying permaculture principles and thinking to what we do at this time, putting in place the new infrastructure in terms of energy reduction, in terms of energy generation, in terms of food production, rethinking how we use urban land, how we connect our towns and cities to the farmland around them, how we reprioritize and revalue the production of food as a career choice, as a thing for young people to get engaged in. There's a whole kind of push that needs to happen, which is around bringing that new economy through, giving it legitimacy, not just talking about it, but actually bringing it alive on the ground. These are things which if we wait for government to do it, it's not going to happen until it's too late. So transition groups, I think, have a really important role. Firstly, as a midwife, to kind of help birth and bring through this new economy. Also to support communities through the grief of leaving behind some of the things that it had been expecting would be lying ahead of it. So I think the role that they play, and it really doesn't matter whether it's called transition or whether it's not called transition, but I think that thinking around resilience, around local economies, is absolutely essential at this time, and so I think the role that transition groups have to play is vital.
Okay, now we come to Italy. Do you know in Italy at what stage is the transition movement? Are you aware of particular projects or situations?
I know there are a few transition projects in Italy, and there have been some of the books we produced have been translated into Italian. So il Manuale di Transizione is around, and Cibo Locale, and what's the other one called? Moneta Locale we have as well. I think we're just making a new film about transition, which will be out in February, March, and that has a story in it about Montevideo in Bologna, which is a very exciting story. Montevideo in Bologna. And Montevideo is a very interesting story in that they were the first, I think, but they've got members of Transition Montevideo who then ran for the local government and who are now on the Comune. And what that has made possible is a really interesting story, I think. I think transition in Italy is still at a much earlier stage probably than it is in the UK or the US, but there's definitely some things happening. Yeah.
has it been a change, any change of your view of the transition process after a few years of its conception, of its?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we always make very clear that transition is an experiment. It's not something which is carved in stone. It's something which is a living experiment, and that everybody who gets involved in transition is told that this is something that by getting involved, you are part of an experiment. You aren't sort of, picking up something which is definitely going to work. Here you are. This is transition. Take it, and it will work anywhere. It's an experiment, and everyone's invited to be part of it. So, in the first book, the Transition Handbook, we very much it was a very early stage, and it basically said, what would it look like if there was a movement which was something a bit like this, and it was a speculative thing, and there was a few stories but not very much. And in the new this is the Transition Companion, which we just published, and this is a much richer look at what transition is, because it's the whole thing is based around the experience of what transition is. So we couldn't have written that when we started. That was something that we had to wait until we'd been running this experiment for 5 years, and we asked everybody for their stories, for their photos, for their posters, for their anecdotes, their things that worked, things that didn't work, and I think that kind of element of self-reflection in transition is something that's really, really, really important. And so I think actually the thing that I found that was really delightful in researching the book was that was the degree of maturity within transition for such a short period of time. It's sort of less than 5 years when I started to go to research it, and within that period of time, it's gone from just having quite a, from people doing quite small projects to people thinking really maturely and intelligently about how do we take this economy of the place that we live and shift it to this economy that it needs to be. What businesses do we need? Who's going to do it? Who knows how to do that? And not a sort of, I suppose, having been involved in permaculture for a long time, the thing that I found a bit frustrating was that sometimes within the permaculture movement, there was a sense that we need to shift society, and permaculture has the tools and the brilliant insights for how do we create this sort of post-fossil fuel society. But then there was but a lot of the people I knew who were involved in it actually seemed very happy for it to be quite a small niche kind of thing, and that actually the idea of really engaging with the mainstream was a bit kind of so it was kind of happy in that place. And for me, we don't have time for that. And so the original thinking about transition was how it's almost like a Trojan horse, the old story of the Trojan horse. How can you put permaculture inside a Trojan horse so that you can wheel the horse past everybody, and they say, "Oh, a nice horse." And you go, "Oh, yes. It's called a transition horse." And you push the horse past everybody, and inside is permaculture, and then actually, it's interesting how with transition, when people have been involved in transition, even if they don't know very much about permaculture, they kind of start thinking in a permaculture way, So maybe that's it's not a replacement for permaculture, but maybe it's another way, of accelerating that thinking.
Yeah, sort of more comprehensive way as well, including other aspects as well, I think. Yes. Okay. So last question is, what is your classic permaculture question? What is your view for the future?
My view for the future, I think the next 5 to 10 years are going to be very, very difficult. I think the combination of what's happening in terms of the euro and the whole debt crisis with the euro, and whether it's I think it's inevitable that there will be defaults, in Greece and maybe with Italy too. I mean, I'm sure you know the situation better than I do, but I think it's only a matter of time, and then I think we're in for a very, very challenging period of time, and particularly when you weave in the whole peak oil issue as well, and the fact that any attempts to kind of make economies grow again will very soon hit against that energy question. I think the challenge really is going to be around how long we can continue with how long it takes before the penny drops in governments and so on, that actually this economic growth thing just is not going to happen, and then we can really focus and move forward. I think our role up until then is just to be modeling and showing what's possible, and showing that actually a post-growth economy could actually be a more nourishing, a more entrepreneurial, a more healthy economy than the one that we have now. And we need to be setting up those businesses so that it becomes the thing that we can step off onto. But I think it's going to be very, very difficult the next 5 to 10 years. And I think we are at the end of the age of cheap energy. We are at the end of the age of growth, And I think, although there is a vision, and a very powerful vision for what a post-growth economy could look like, and we can do it, and I think it'll be fantastic. But I think there's that interim period is going to be hard work, and I think that we should all be really entering that time with the feeling that we are here to serve that time, and the work that we do is of service to people in this time, which is going to be very fast moving and unpredictable and difficult. And the best service we can do is to model and start to build the new economy that we need on the ground, really.
Okay, thank you, Rob, for your time. Okay, Rob, I just stopped the recording now. I'll just say bye just for the camera. But anyway, I'll thank you very much anyway for your time, really.
Pleasure.